They shoved me into the padded chair and the door sealed. A metal click landed like a verdict. Fear burned in my throat and pushed my hands to the armrests before I could think. Sit. A voice said from the one-way window. The window did not answer my eyes. I heard a boot scrape and then the key turn. Within that first minute, the central problem was clear. The room itself had been designed to take away my sounds, and with them, my place in the world. I speak in a voice that tests its own shape now, because when the silence begins, it alters the way you weigh decisions. My name is Subject 47, but names mean nothing in padded rooms. They are tokens on a string. I am mid-30s, lean, and I keep my hands visible because I have learned early to let others see that I am not reaching for a weapon. The first 5 minutes are always a test. 2 men in grey straps behind the glass. Guard Ramos with a short, efficient jaw. The interrogator with a posture that measured my reaction like an instrument. Ramos set down a small metal basket. Dra. Hale removed 2 earplugs from wrapping with gloved fingers. 2 hours to start. The interrogator, if you resist, we extend. The words were clinical, sterile. Fear shifted into calculation, the first emotion shift, because fear makes me count options. I felt for the notebook taped to my thigh, fingers catching the torn edge. I pressed my palm against paper to remind myself that some things could still be touched. They fit the straps with mechanical motions. 1 over the chest, 2 across my wrists, 1 around my knees. The straps smelled faintly of rubber and old sweat. Dra. Hale moved with professional distance, his hands steady. Relax your jaw, he said, and that was an instruction I could obey. The interrogator pointed to the padded walls and then to the small slit above the door where a circle of light leaked in. You will not hear the world from that room, he said. When they fed the earplugs into my hands, I hesitated. I wanted to hear their names again. I wanted to hold the sound of their breathing in my palm as proof they existed on the other side of glass. I chose to place 1 earplug on the armrest instead of both. That little rebellion felt like a theft. Fear narrowed into defiance, the second emotion shift. Why leave 1? Ramos. He my name aloud. Subject 47. I kept my eyes on his shadow. They did not answer questions beyond procedure. The interrogator described the experiment in plain language. Engineered quiet, sensory removal, the aim to erode orientation. He spoke like a man reading a manual. No marks. No confessions forced by pain. We remove the world and wait for the mind to offer itself. Lights dimmed by degrees until candlelight bulbs hummed behind protective covers, casting the room in a muddied gold that softened the padding to the color of dry skin. The monitoring panel in the observation niche clicked and registered numbers I could not name. They left instruments, they did not stay. When the last footstep receded, I tried to speak. My words hit the padded wall and folded. No echo came back. My voice had been swallowed between layers of foam and treated fiber. The absence of reply was not calm. It was a pressure that required an answer and punished the attempt to ask. I tapped the armrests once, twice. The sound was a hand against padding. I tried a low hum to give my throat something physical to do. The hum stopped as if someone had pressed a hand over my mouth from the other side. I realized then that silence was not merely lack. It was a discipline enforced by architecture and protocol. My breathing became a metronome. Fear calcified to a tight, methodical attention. A folded page slid under the chair like a small, deliberate lie. I did not hear the technician who pushed it. I only noticed the paper catching on my shoe. The shorthand symbol on the page matched no bureaucratic code I knew. Below it was a list of cell numbers and a sequence of single letters. The paper told me 2 things at once. I was not the only subject, and someone wanted me to know that. Suspicion flared, an early flicker of doubt that forced me to reframe the experiment as part of a system, not a one-off cruelty. I tried to call through the glass, "Who sent the paper?" I said, but the glass gave me nothing. The interrogator returned to the window but kept his face down. "You will be monitored," he said. "You will be recorded." No verbal contact until protocol ends. He did not look at De Hale. I set the paper in my lap and opened the notebook. My handwriting is small. I have trained it to be so. I wrote the symbol, the numbers, and then the first rule I had learned: document what matters before they take it. The notebook is a heavy thing on my thigh, its edges rubbed raw by continual folding. It is my voice in ink. An hour in, the monitoring instruments announced a discrepancy with a low mechanical chirp. A light blinked in the observation box. I knocked on the armrest, fast, then slow, testing whether the sensors would pick rhythm. They did. The intercom crackled and the interrogator's voice snapped. Hold pattern, then, quieter, who taught him that? I pushed my palms flat to the padded wall and began to tap a coded rhythm, short, long, short, patterns I had learned long before the last transfer. The tapping was a physical counter to the enforced quiet. It was a way to produce evidence of intent without words. My fingertips numbed from the vibration, but the rhythm mattered. On the other side, the team's leader recognized the sequence. I heard boots shuffle, a piece of paper flutter in a hand, a door unlatch in the background. The observation window filled with movement, arms, faces, light. The interrogator strode back to the slit with something like alarm. Stop him, he said. Now, Ramos shouted my number. I kept tapping and added variation until their urgency became audible through the glass. Footsteps, the rustle of a jacket, the metal tongue of a key. They burst the door. It came open with a rough, wet sound as if someone had pulled a blanket from a table. Hands seized my arms. The interrogator's face was close to the slit and his eyes were open sharp. What is this? He demanded, the room filled with bodies and cameras. A cameraman said, Get the notebook. A technician slid a gloved hand under me and pulled the folded page free. The interrogator barked. Who instructed him? Dra. Hale stilled at the doorway, his hand frozen on a clipboard. Ramos kept a hold on my shoulder and said, You started a protocol breach, subject 47. Explain. I said nothing at first. My mouth tasted of the paste they used to affix earplugs. I tapped a pattern. I said I tapped the code, my voice cut like a dry leaf. Rapid exchanges followed, 3, 4, 5 lines, sharp and mechanical. Who taught you? The interrogator demanded. No one. I said, Liar. Ramos. Check the log, Jefter Hale. There was an insertion 15 minutes ago. A folded page under seat 12. His tone held a hesitation that looked like sympathy and fear wrapped together. They took the notebook and the page. They searched me with gloved hands and moved quickly but not roughly, as if to avoid leaving marks they could later be asked to explain. Cameras clicked. The interrogator into his radio, lock the network, sweep the facility. They led me into the corridor, the air outside the chamber colder and metallic. Dra. Hale paused at the threshold. For a moment he looked at the chair where I had sat, and then at the earplug still on the armrest. With a movement I could not read, he bent and slipped that single earplug into his pocket. He did not meet my eyes. The door sealed behind us with a different, administrative click. That small act hung between us like a private verdict. In the corridor, the team argued in clipped sentences. We must follow protocol. The interrogator, we cannot allow contagion of method. If this is a network, we need names. Ramos answered, we need papers. Hale kept his hands in his pockets and said, The earplug, leave it. It is evidence. They processed me in a room that reeked of antiseptic. The cameras that had been pointed at me now turned inward, recording my body as if it were a specimen. I watched them catalogue my scars and the ritualistic ink mark on my nape. I watched them photograph the thin scar at my temple. I kept my jaw steady and let them think they were the only ones holding facts. When they left, I was taken to a temporary cell where the fluorescent light hummed and my hands were free. Fear had shifted into resolve, my third emotion shift, because the scramble had revealed that my small gesture had meaning to them. It showed I belonged to something wider. I needed to use that leverage. I asked to speak to Gia Hale. The request was an action rather than a speech. It is easier to push through a request than to justify a position. Jefter Hale, I said when he came, why did you slip the earplug back on the chair? He looked at me like a man who had been asked to account for a private mercy. I did not, he replied finally. I only touched it. You left it. I said, you left a piece of sense. Why, he swallowed. Because we are not monsters, he said, and then he closed his eyes as if to avoid the next question. His voice had a brittle quality. Because some of us measure harm differently, we argued in short lines. You contradict protocol. The interrogator later, when he walked in, you returned evidence. That undermines control. Control is not the same as truth. Jefter Hale answered, we have to know what happens here. The exchange had 4 sharp turns. It did not resolve. That night I wrote what they had done into my notebook with specific detail. The angle of the slit above the door, the composition of the earplugs, the way the padding treated sound by absorbing higher frequencies first. I catalogued names. Ramos, due to hail the interrogator. I wrote down the shorthand from the folded page and the cell numbers listed. Writing kept my hands moving. It kept me from thinking too long about the way silence reconstructs a person from the inside. A mid-chapter discovery arrived as a technician shoved a photograph under the door. A grainy image of a different cell, the same padded walls, a different number handwritten on the back. The photograph was proof that the program stretched beyond this facility. The revelation shifted stakes again. This was not an isolated test, but an organized method of erasure. I felt the pattern like a new wound. They scheduled another session the next morning. This time the interrogator moved with less certainty. Ramos searched my pockets twice. "Draw?" Hale lingered at the window and looked at me in a way that contained questions he would not voice. The technicians were colder. The cameras were turned on me like patient animals. In the chamber I tried to force conversation through action. I pressed my forehead to the padded wall and made a small, deliberate mark with the nail of my thumb on the seam, a notch only I would know to check. I left the notch as a promise to myself, a physical record of presence. When the team returned to the window, they noticed the notch. The interrogator swore. "Where did that come from?" He demanded. "You made it in a closed room." Ramos smiled with a mouth that did not reach his eyes. He did it to himself. Ramos, to prove something. "He is tricky." The interrogator's voice rose. "We remove the world, not create artifacts." I kept tapping patterns into the padding at irregular intervals. The tapping was a conversation with people who refused to answer. It was also a way to force them to move, to reveal their reactions. Each time they reacted, I learned a detail about who watched and how they would respond. The climax arrived when my coded tapping matched a break in the observation schedule and triggered an unexpected reaction on the team. The interrogator panicked. Ramos moved to force compliance. Hale hesitated and then acted in a way that contradicted his earlier distance. I turned silence into accusation, and they answered with motion. They stormed the door in a shorter, rougher scramble than the first time. The interrogator demanded to see the notebook. A cameraman photographed my face at an odd angle. In the chaos, Hale bent and slipped the same earplug into his lab coat pocket. For the second time, he made a small gesture that held both mercy and complicity. When the door closed again, I was left with a torn corner of the folded page and a single earplug hidden inside my sleeve. I felt the earplug as a contraband talisman. I put it to my ear once and then tucked it away. The object had weight beyond its size. The chapter ends with an act of documentation. I sit in the dimmed chamber and write the names and actions into the notebook in hard, plain lines. I write down the notch I made in the seam, the time of the breach, the words said by Ramos and the interrogator. I place the torn corner of the folded page beside the entry and press both under a thin strip of adhesive tape. Outside the chamber, I hear a distant door close and a low radio static that suggests movement, not rest. Hale's hesitation and the interrogator's harsh tone have rearranged what I know. There are people inside the system who record injuries and people who try to hide them. I end the chapter with a decision. I will keep the notebook, I will keep the notch, and I will find a way to make the pattern speak beyond the padded walls. The final line is a physical action. I slide the notebook into the inner lining of my jacket and feel the paper fold against my sternum. I breathe in through my nose, feeling the air as a simple thing to count, and then I begin again to tap a rhythm into the padding. Not to summon rescue, but to leave a track of presence that might be read by others later. That tapping is a promise turned into a small, precise motion. They yanked me from the padded chair and pushed my face toward the one-way glass. Betrayal sat in my throat. Every movement by the staff confirmed a system I thought contained had more teeth than I remembered. Eyes straight, Klein ordered, and a guard's hand settled at the back of my neck to keep my head from turning. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and candle smoke. Within those first seconds, the central problem was obvious. They would remove sound until I could not prove I had been a person. I had learned in the padded chair that a sealed door and silence do things a knife does not. Today, they planned to escalate the method and watch the measurements rise. I kept my jaw loose so they could not read a flinch. The observatory light hummed behind the glass. Klein stood 2 steps left of the window, Supervisor Hart by the console, Mara smaller in the doorway with her technician bag. Guards lined the corridor like punctuation. Subject 47. Klein, you remember procedure. Cooperate, and the protocol shortens. His voice had the clipped cadence of someone who records mercy as an efficiency metric. I answered by pressing my palms flat to the metal rim of the bench until the tendons in my wrists tightened. That was how I marked presence. Skin to object, pressure, a small proof. My fingers traced the stitching in the institutional sleeve until the knuckle whitened. They brought me here after the padded chair episode. The recall was not a story, it was a list of concrete acts. In the other room, the click of a key had sealed me before. Today the technicians had timers and a new sealing rig. The stakes were simple and immediate. If they succeeded, sound would be erased. If they failed, alarms would break their control. Klein walked the perimeter like someone inspecting a patient. Heart, he said, name clipped. Initialize protocol Delta. Record baseline. Hart's fingers slid across the console. The screen blinked readouts. Decibels, neural markers, time to seal. Technician Mara stayed at the threshold. I watched her lips when Hart spoke. The shape of her responses told me she was not entirely an instrument of the program. Her eyes moved to my notebook hanging on my chest and then away. They planted Subject 12 in full view like an exhibit. Subject 12's shoulders slumped. His jaw kept twitching. Klein motioned, demonstration, and Mara approached with the ear, seal rig folded in her hands. Mara strapped the first seal onto Subject 12's head with practiced, clinical movements. She calibrated dials under a lamp, listened to the tone, Klein, and a low mechanical whisper began as the seal locked. Subject 12 made a small sound, a dry cough swallowed by the apparatus. I watched the way Subject 12's mouth moved when he tried to speak. No sound left his lips. His hands found his throat and clawed at the padding. Hart panned a readout and tapped a note, identity markers dropping. He said, not a question. I forced myself to name aloud the sequence of my small life names, dates, the address of the room where I had first learned silence. I said them in rhythms like counting breath. Klein counted each lapse and jotting. My voice shook. The staff recorded each stutter as data. Say your mother's name, Klein. He used my name to test a specific tether, Anna L. Ortiz, I said. I felt my mouth shape the consonants like anchors. Hart's fingers paused. The screen showed a tiny plateau in the waveform. He noted. I felt suspicion first, the idea that someone I had trusted inside this facility might break ranks. That suspicion moved my body. I stiffened my shoulders. I watched Mara for the exact moment she would look away. Suspicion pushed me to demand small certainties I could store in my head. That suspicion would shift. Mara stepped closer and, in the motion of brushing the console, slid a folded scrap into the sleeve of my garment. My shoulder brushed hers. She did not speak. Her breath smelled of solder and wax. I felt the paper go into my shirt and used a corner of the cuff to keep it there. Hart barked a command and the corridor lights dimmed as the protocol progressed. The technicians tightened clamps. The one-way glass hid their faces in the amber glare. They were calibrating silence the way a surgeon calibrates an incision. Klein's voice cut through. We begin phase 2. No external cues allowed. Record starts now. A timer clicked audible even through the muffled room. The staff watched the displays. The central conflict settled around that digital clock. If they could engineer silence long enough, identity would fray. They led me back into the antechamber where the ear-sealed demonstration had been staged. Subject 12 sat with eyes closed and a small moan, like someone failing to catch a note. Mara did not look at him. She watched me instead, and her fingers went to her pocket as if weighing a choice. I asked quietly, Mara, my voice was raw. She nodded once. She had not given her name before. Mara, I repeated, soft, and her fingers tightened around the cardboard of her tool case. She leaned close enough that the wire mesh of the doorway hid her mouth, but not the movement. There are logs, she said. There is a time when the waveform dips and the machine registers a certain collapse. I wrote it down. Her voice came out measured, not an oath. Her admission shifted me. Doubt had been a tool. Now I had a point to act on. I slid my hand toward the scrap, pretending to smooth my sleeve. I felt the paper under my palm, folded small and damp with sweat. The scrap had numbers, times, a list of neural collapse signatures, and worse, an entry labeled, internal descent. Klein barked, hands where I can see them. The guard's voice was a saw. I obeyed, letting my fingers show empty. He stepped closer, heavy boots scuffing the linoleum. The contact was deliberate, meant to remind me of how small my options were. Mara's face was close enough to read. A single line traced the corner of her mouth that did not belong to someone satisfied with their job. I read her expression as clearly as the numbers she had given me. It meant she had risked a record and wanted me to use it. They sealed me again into the inner chamber. The quilted walls swallowed sound. A metal armature clicked over my ears. The technicians tightened the last bolts. The monitor above the door showed a sharp incline as the seal completed. Inside that black, the first change was not silence but pressure against my skull. My breathing became loud in my own head. There was a ringing tone like two machines arguing. I began to count aloud because counting was the one thing I could do that made a measurable waveform on their screens. I pushed words through clenched teeth. When they could not hear me, I spoke louder. I hammered names against the padding. My throat hurt. The machine tracked my attempts and Hart circled numbers on his pad. After a few minutes, a thin sound cut through, an odd clipped rhythm like a distant key tapping. I had no way to know if it came from outside the seal, or whether Mara had planted some tiny device to produce it. The sound became a promise of external presence. I performed a deliberate act to force their hand. I began to pound my palms against the padded chair in a steady tempo. The impact vibrated the seals. I marked beats I knew they could see on the waveform display. 3 hits, pause, 2 hits, sustained. The response was immediate. The monitor registered spikes and alarms began to blink red. Voices swelled outside, sharp, professional. Guards cursed. Hart shouted orders I could not hear clearly. The protocol flickered. Doors banged open and boots rushed the corridor. I felt a heavy weight as the inner chamber was breached and light slashed into the blackout. Hands grabbed my arms. The pressure in my skull flipped into pain from the sudden change. Mara appeared at the threshold as guards crowded in and Klein barked a list of violations. One guard hauled her by the elbow and slammed her against the console. His name was Larson. He had been at the perimeter since the first chapter. He hit her shoulder with a palm and hissed, "What did you do?" Mara's reply was a single short sentence, not a plea. I gave him a cue. Her chin was raised. Larson pushed her face away with the heel of his hand and spat. "You risked everything," Klein demanded. "Explain." Hart looked between the readouts and the panic. The data showed an external spike at exactly the moment I had pounded the seat, and then a faint second pattern that did not match any system output. She planted a device, Larson, pressing a gloved hand into Mara's shoulder. "Sabotage." His voice was line, broken, accusing. Mara did not deny it. Klein's interrogation became quick, repeated lines. "Mara, what device? Who ordered? Why?" His cadence was meant to separate truth from rehearsed statements. Mara's answer was another measured fact. It produces a timed vibration external to the seal. Short cue only. I wired it to a scrubbed relay. I wanted them to break protocol when they saw the anomaly. Her voice did not tremble. Hart's mouth thinned. The twist rewired how everyone read the earlier demonstration. No longer was the equipment a passive method. It was a contested instrument. The staff realized someone inside the program had introduced an unpredictable variable. Klein moved like a man closing a file. He barked orders and 2 guards hauled Mara away. "You will face review," he said. Larson's grip tightened. The guards bundled her into a quarantine corridor. She tossed one last look to the glass. Our eyes locked. In the aftermath, the technicians took down Subject 12 and rolled him away in a slump. The console readouts were drowned in warning tones that Hart silenced with a flat swipe. He recorded the event not as alarm, but as a notation. Back in the holding cell, I sat on the padded bench and unfolded Mara's scrap. The handwriting was small and cramped, but exact. Time stamps, waveform shapes, a single name. Hart, next to the name, an abbreviation. Sync. The discovery shifted my suspicion into a new register. It was not only that someone doubted the program. A higher-level technician, Hart, had scheduled synchronized tests. Either Hart was experimenting with a variation or he was recording dissent as a variable. The paper did not tell motive, only fact. I wrote the numbers into my battered notebook with a stub of pencil. My handwriting was clumsy from the pounding heart but legible. I drew the waveform peaks and labeled them. Writing made facts durable. That is why I kept a notebook. A guard knocked on the cell grill and pushed a tray through. His name was Ortega. He was a young man with rounded shoulders and a hesitant jaw. He did not look at me directly. "You need to eat," He said Ortega, I said. I repeated his name because a name fixes a person. He blinked. He had been on perimeter duty the night they first sealed me. You were there when they closed the door, I added. He nodded. Slow, yes, he said. You made noise. They recorded it. He closed the cell and left. The corridor hummed with resumed routines, as if the breach had been a weather event rather than a structural fault. I spent the rest of the night encoding Mara's scrap into the notebook with precise margins and headings. Each entry became a small, measurable act of resistance. I wrote the time the breach occurred. I listed who was present. I included how Hart's readouts had changed. 2 shifts in emotion had already tracked across me. Suspicion when Mara first looked at me, and then a brittle hope when I realized someone had planted a cue to disrupt the seal. Later, after the breach, that hope hardened into a wary resolve as I recorded facts instead of spinning fantasies. In a quieter hour, I overheard Hart argue with Klein through the observation window. You pulled back up too late, Hart. The device introduced noise but also risked subject collapse. His voice was tight. Klein replied, risk is acceptable when data holds. You know that? You authorized Phase 2 and these are known tolerances. The exchange named an operational conflict, and I listened for the word that would determine protocol continuity. Hart's answer was practical, not rhetorical. We will log the variance and adjust parameters. No public records. Keep it internal. If oversight finds out, we lose the program. His hand hovered over the console, closing a file. The scene revealed a fracture I had only suspected. Hart and Klein agreed on outcomes but not on acceptable risks. The knowledge changed my options. If the program could be adjusted, someone could also weaponize dissent as protocol leverage. At dawn, I smuggled a copy of the waveform into my notebook and hid it beneath the stitched seam of the binding. The seam had been chewed by time and tape. It was accessible. I felt the paper there like a second pulse against my ribs. The chapter's cliffhanger arrived when I noticed Subject 12's eyes open and find mine through the observation glass. He mouthed something I could not hear. He tapped his temple 3 times and then pointed outward, toward the maintenance corridor where Mara had been taken. That gesture suggested more than solidarity. It suggested a path. If Mara had planted devices, then maintenance routes held vulnerabilities. If maintenance held vulnerabilities, there might be ways to create external cues again. The idea made my hands tremble. Before the guards returned for rounds, I stitched the new waveform into the notebook and labeled it Echoes Behind Glass. The title was practical, not poetic. It told what it was and where it happened. I closed the book and felt the weight of a small proof. Larson marched Mara past the door later, flanked by 2 guards and a third dragging a sealed black case. She did not look at me. Larson knocked the case against his leg like a punctuation mark. When he passed the observation window, his jaw worked once, and he spat on the floor. Klein called a briefing and the staff assembled in the outer room. Hart stood at the terminal with the console lights on his face. He described adjustments and new calibrations. No one used the word betrayal, but their hands and the angle of their shoulders said why the word existed. At the end of the meeting, Klein left with a sealed envelope and Hart remained to replay the footage. I watched Hart's face as he stared at the screen. He pressed his thumb along the side of his nose in a single, precise motion I had seen in the footage a dozen times. I slept in short bursts. Each time I woke, my throat felt raw from speaking names aloud, and my hands ached from the pounding that had caused the breach. The rawness answered memory. How my fists slammed, how the seal vibrated, how the monitors blinked red. In the final hour before another shift change, a guard slid a folded photograph under the door. It was a maintenance corridor map with a smear of grease at the corner and a handwritten note. Hart meets here, night cycle 3. The photograph smelled of engine oil. I held the map until the light thinned and then tucked it into the same seam as Mara's waveform. The 2 items together were a pattern. A name tied to places and times. I could not yet draw a motive, but I could gather evidence. When the shift change, Klein walked past my cell and did not look in. Larson trailed with him, his boots clacking. Larson stopped and said a single word I heard plain. Control. That word meant reinforcement would come and the program would either tighten or break. My choices narrowed to small actions. Encode, hide, test again. My notebook had become a ledger of survival and accusation. I spent the last moments of the chapter writing a direct instruction to anyone who might find the book. Record times, record names, mark the moment of breach. I wrote it in the first person and dated it. The act of addressing an unknown reader made the record a weapon. Outside, the facility resumed its mechanical breath. Inside, I closed the page and heard a faint external alarm tick. The sound was small but unmistakable. A secondary system tripped because of the earlier breach. I ran a finger along the seam where the map and waveform hid. My hands did not shake as much as they had earlier. The emotion that had started as betrayal had moved through suspicion and hope and settled into a careful determination. That determination would be the instrument of the next choice. A guard at the corridor called a name I had not heard before. Subject 12 report. Subject 12 was wheeled toward a different observation room. His eyes met mine again, and he tapped 3 times at his temple in the same code. I answered his gesture by pressing my palm to the glass, nails biting into flesh until the sting arrived. The panel did not register that touch. It was a private signal exchange between 2 people who had learned the cost of proof. The last concrete event occurred when a maintenance door at the far end of the corridor opened and a figure in a grey jacket stepped into the light. Hart's head snapped to the doorway. He swallowed and reached for his radio. The figure stepped away before anyone could call. That figure was the closing beat. A deliberate movement connected to Hart's midnight meeting place on the map. It shifted the immediate problem into a sharper one. Someone with access was moving when they should not be. I closed my notebook and slid it under my mattress. The written witness and the photograph were small, physical things that demanded choices from anyone who read them. My final act in the chapter was to knock 3 times on the padded wall in a steady code. The knock was a signal and a promise. I had recorded the breach. The chapter ends with a guard's boot echoing down the corridor and a light turning in the observation room. My hand left a faint print on the padded wall. The print was the final concrete mark, an action that ties this chapter directly to the next. They hauled me down the concrete service corridor and slammed the heavy annex door until the metal bit into the jamb. Klein's boot hit my ribs as they shoved me through, and the lock clacked like a verdict. Fear sat in the back of my throat and made my hands go rigid on the collar as Gar pulled the cloth from my pockets. The technician's fingers were clinical, efficient, searching for anything that could carry a sound. Hand the book, Klein. And the single sentence became the command that opened the day. Within those first seconds I understood the central problem. They would not merely silence me for a while. They intended this silence to be final and absolute. I had already been in a padded chair twice before. They had shoved me into that same chair in a smaller room and pushed my face to the glass once until my jaw ached. The corridor smelled of disinfectant and candle soot now, the same smell that had clung to my skin after the first sessions. I remembered the padded chair and the one-way glass from before, and I brought that concrete memory forward into the corridor because it mattered. The annex was the instrument, not merely a room. That memory tightened the choices I made in the next minutes. They dragged me until the fluorescent lights gave way to the low, hollow glow of the annex vestibule. Technician Gar kept his hand at my nape. Careful, he said. Do not make a sound and do not struggle. Klein shoved me into a narrow alcove. Voss stood with a panel folder and a tablet, eyes scanning. Their faces carried the same indifferent calibration I had seen earlier, but today the indifferent faces had an edge. This time they'd removed every visible tool I could use to speak or to mar. They stripped the outside of my collar until only the old cloth bindings remained. When they forced me into the annex entrance, I felt the air change. It was cooler and compressed, a physical tightness that pushed at lungs and ears. They forced my arms to the chair and strapped the bindings tight. Sit, Klein ordered, as if the single-word order could set a procedure in motion. I sat. Voss walked the room and read aloud the steps as the technicians worked. Clamps, seals, telemetry checked, no external microphones, no drains. They explained nothing beyond the checklists. My fear hardened into a different current, something that smelled of calculation and moral fracture. The fear pushed me to listen for opportunities. It made my hands start to move under the straps, testing the old seams. The lead technician, Gar, fixed the ear seal assembly over my temples while a foam lining creaked. This will remove echo. Drr. Voss, his voice flat on the other side of the panel. He touched a knob. A tiny whir began and then faded into an engineered hush. The room grew dead in a way the padded chair had never achieved. In the past, pain left marks you could point to. Here the method was to deny me sound so thoroughly that I could not even recall how a voice fit inside my mouth. That aim changed the stakes. They were not trying to break my bones, they were trying to break the memory of myself. A metallic latch fell somewhere in the observation suite and banged against metal so loudly that I instinctively flinched. For a heartbeat, the sealed annex was not absolute. I seized that sound like a plank in a storm. I stretched my fingers and tapped a rhythm at the seam of my collar where the cloth had worn thin. It was a small action, precise and physical, and it bought me a single breath of agency. The staff reacted instantly. Gar tightened a strap. Klein stepped closer and said, "Do not make that mistake again, 47. The words had a purpose. The team weaponized even accidental noises to remind us how fragile any anchor would be. Drah. Voss removed a panel and showed me a small monitor inset with 4 gray windows. Faces moved in those panes, other subjects, pinned by the same light and the same apparatus. He pointed at one screen and named the subject, Mex Hale. See how they sit, see how their eyes go. That protocol is what erases identity. He tapped the glass, where the figure's lips tried to shape a word that the camera did not register. Voss's hand was calm. We do not want confession. Voss, we need absence. His words were a revelation and a new wound. Up to that point I believed their purpose had been pressure, information. Now I understood the method's full design, deliberate erasure. I had no time for slow despair. The knowledge of what they would do shifted my fear into another current, anger edged with an urgent need to act. I slid my fingers under the old seam and managed, against the straps, to catch a thread. I pulled until a small loop loosened, and then used the loop to slide the ear clamp's foam just enough to create a paper, thin air gap. The action was precise and felt like theft. Gar was distracted by a telemetry line argument across the panel. Klein was checking an annotation for escalation protocols. Voss kept one hand on the monitor. My fingers tapped a faint rhythm into the padding, a staccato I hoped someone else could feel. A technician's voice snapped. Telemetry spike on channel 2. Gar swore and moved to check the readout. Klein barked, "Who did that?" and his voice ricocheted off the observation glass. I kept tapping, my rhythm simple. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. I had learned earlier that people listen for structure. My tiny code could be heard in vibration if someone else were within contact. For the space of a breath I believed Mex Hale might answer. That belief was not poetic. It was a tactical gamble. The gamble worked in a brittle way. A muffled answer, no more than a cough, arrived from the other suit, and drr. Voss's fingers tightened on the monitor. Klein leaned forward and hissed, "You hear that, Hale? Better quiet yourself." Gar moved toward the doorway and dragged a curtain to block sight. They used Mex Hale not as a person but as a dial. A threat that could be raised or lowered to change my threshold. That shift in the room's behavior, turning a human being into a lever, was a moral fracture that I could not let stand unnoticed. I tried to speak once. The sound was a strained thing, close to a whisper. Klein's hand hit the armrest and he said, "Don't waste your breath," with a kind of tired cruelty that suggested this had happened many times before. Drah. Voss stepped forward and spoke like a note in a ledger. Subject 47 is attempting to communicate. Increase compression by 30%. Isolate echo nodes. He handed Gar instructions and they moved with quiet efficiency. Their decisions changed the ambience of the room. They actively raised the stakes. My fear buckled into a more raw, physical reaction. My jaw clenched, my hands trembled, and my lung drew a hard breath against the fox silence. I did not intend to remain a passive subject. Using the loop I had created, I rubbed the edge of my notebook, a taped, dog-eared thing I keep pressed to my chest, against the padding until a small scrap of paper tore free. I folded the scrap into a tight pellet and pushed it into the hollow of my wrist where the bindings could not reach. The action was minute and practical. Hide evidence. Gar's back was turned. Klein had gone to the observation door to shout at Mex Hale. Those movements provided me with a sliver of cover. Klein returned with blood on his knuckles from grabbing Hale's sleeve and shoved Hale's face into the observation doorway as if to present a commodity. "Keep watching." Klein Voss, let him see. Hale's eyes were glassy and distant. Klein's presence in the doorway functioned as a threat device. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I saw a choice forming under pressure. Continue to try a coded contact and risk escalation, or keep the scrap hidden and wait for a better opening. My decision would shape everything that followed. I chose contact. I used the scrap to record a new rhythm, shorter, sharper, and scraped it against my arm to leave a faint impression anyone watching for marks might see. Technician Gar glanced at me and his eyes flicked to my hands as if to read intent. Gar, I said under my breath, forcing the name as a probe. He looked up sharply. Gar, I repeated louder this time. His face did not register betrayal. It registered calculation. He did not answer verbally. He closed his mouth and moved his head almost imperceptibly. That subtle signal was everything. The room erupted in a way I had not expected. Klein flung the observation door wide and shoved Hale back with a sharp elbow. Stop that. Klein, you will not move. Voss barked into his tablet. Seal the feed. Increase sedation protocols on breach 3. Gar's jaw worked. He had chosen a side in that instant by not exposing me. A decision had been made in my favor that cost Gar something in the eyes of his superiors. The energy in the room shifted. The staff's plan for absolute erasure collided with an improvised resistance begun with a thread and a scrap. In the scuffle that followed, I acted on a raw, animal clarity. I slashed my palm against the seal and tore at the foam lining with my fingers. The ear assembly gave with a wet, muffled sound, and for the first time since they had sealed the annex I heard the wet rip of compressed rubber and cloth. It was not impressive, it was decisive. Klein lunged and the two of us tangled under the light. The room became immediate. Gar yelling, "De der!" Voss swinging a metal clipboard, the observation glass ringed by faces. I forced my shoulder and twisted toward the arcade of the door where the monitoring panels rested. "Stop him!" Klein shouted, "Hold him!" The staff swarmed. Gar grabbed my shoulder and twisted a strap to hold me down even as I flailed. "De dra!" Voss tried to reach the monitor and his hand knocked the camera off its mount. The camera fell with a small, obscene clatter and the observation panes collapsed into gray. In that moment of crashing equipment, the engineered silence broke the way an old instrument breaks under sudden force. Sound came back as chaotic, not as the ordered echo they preferred, and my voice ripped out of my chest in a single, hoarse shout. I remember the sound because it did not belong to their system any longer. It belonged to me. I screamed. The scream did not carry confession or carefully formed words, but it carried enough anger and grief to make Klein flinch and Gar pause. Dra. Voss reached toward the recorder and cursed because the telemetry it had relied upon had been compromised. For a handful of seconds we were not in the annex protocol at all. We were in an immediate physical confrontation where hands and fists and feet decided outcomes. They subdued me with sedatives and with greater numbers. A syringe bit my thigh and my legs folded as though a weak wire had been cut. Klein's weight pressed down and Gar's fingers found the notebook at my waist before I could tuck it away. Dra. Voss clicked a pen and made precise notes about the breach, his voice a flat register above the room's grunts. Subject attempted interference, Voss into the tablet, pronouncing events as if a report could absorb the violence. They dragged me out of the chair while my lungs tried to find breath through chemical fog. The annex door opened and the cool, sterile air of the observation room hit me like a slap. They left me in the observation room and pulled a blanket over my shoulders. My protest was a single short sentence. "Where is Hale?" Klein looked at Voss and said, "He is fine. Stabilize him for transfer." Voss's face tightened, but he kept his hand steady on the tablet. Gar, who had not wanted the println of a clipboard, but had looked at me when no one else did not meet my eyes. He pushed the chair back and muttered, "Keep breathing, 47. His phrase was not kindness. It was instruction. I used his presence and the way his shoulders hunched as an anchor to retrieve the scrap from the hollow of my wrist. When the technicians argued offstage, I worked fast and without show. I eased the taped notebook out from where I had hidden it and slid it to the hem of my collar with practiced care. The motion was small and concrete, a roll of paper into fabric. My fingers were slick with sweat, and I wiped them on my sleeve. Gar noticed the movement. He shifted, and for a second, his face said more than his words. There was risk, yes, and a choice. He did not touch me to stop the concealment. Instead, he pushed the observation room's curtain aside and called to the others with a clipped voice, "Drat de vos. Gar, we'll keep it moving. Sanitize the logs and let housekeeping sweep the annex in 2 hours. Seal any extra footage for procedural review." His statements were cover and coordination. Klein barked an order back and Drat de vos nodded. Their actions resolved the immediate conflict. They would report a breach, administer sedatives, log an incident, and continue. But in that exchange, they also left a space where a small ledger might survive. They wheeled me to a holding cell, and the walk was a procession of bodies and expertise. In the corridor, a door clanged, and the echo rolled through the concrete like a test of endurance. I kept my chin down and focused on touch. The texture of the blanket, the tightness of the wrist bindings, the dirt under Gar's nails when he slid a tray my way. Those tactile facts kept my head from dissolving into panic. They matter because this was not about metaphors. It was about practical survival. I kept a record of what happened by feeling and by the small acts I could still control. In the holding cell there, Voss sat across from me and wrote details into his tablet as if he logged organisms in a lab. "Why did you tear the assembly?" he asked. "Why attempt communication?" He, like a scientist curious for variables. "Because you were erasing people," I said. "Because you call it a protocol and you make people disappear." I kept my sentences short. Voss's voice did not change much. "We are studying thresholds," he replied, "the threshold of identity. We must test until our signals fail." His words tried to put a clinical roof over what I knew to be cruelty. They did not change me. Klein came in and stood heavy in the doorway. "You are lucky, 47, he said. "You broke a seal and you survived because Gar intervened. Next time you will not be so lucky." His voice was a threat tethered to process. Klein's threat mapped the institutional logic. Escalation, then correction. Gar looked at Klein and for a half-second his expression was unreadable. I could not tell if he agreed or feared the alternative. This moment forced an emotional shift in me. Anger cooled into cautious recognition. If Gar could move a ledger, he might be an ally in a system that parades efficiency as righteousness. Gar took a tray and set a cup of water in front of me. He put his hand near where my collar bulged with the hidden notebook and said simply, "Keep your hands where I can see them, 47. He did not order me to open the collar. He did not ask for the book. The instruction felt like a test. I kept my fingers closed and let the book rest against the crease between my neck and shoulder. Gar's breath made a warm drift of air near my ear. It was neither friend nor foe. "You tapped." I saw it. I held that sentence. Gar's admission was a small fracture in the seemingly monolithic procedure. We talked then in short bursts, Gar and I, while Voss completed his records and Klein paced. Gar's words were clipped. His rhythm was practical. "You did not have to shout. Gar, you could have died for that." "I know," I said. "I still did it." Our exchange was economy. No speeches, only facts. Gar spoke of logistics and of a man named Hale who would be transferred to a different wing for further testing. He did not promise rescue. He described windows of opportunity and times when cameras rotated blind spots. His voice was low and technical. Through his detail I learned where they left room for human error in the protocol, in schedule changes, in maintenance, in who read a log. The chapter reached its subtle denouement in the corridor outside the annex. Voss finished his notes and said, "Make sure the ledger is inaccessible. Remove any extra paper from his property." Klein agreed. Gar hesitated and then moved to place the tray on the cart. The cart's shadow fell across my chest like a final accounting. I did not wait for permission. I slid 2 pages of the notebook beneath the collar and tucked them into the seam where the threads crossed. I fingered the corner of the paper until I felt the fibers settle. The action was performed quietly, as if each fold were a last prayer. Before they took me down the corridor, Gar leaned close and said, "If anyone asks, you fought them. Say you tried to break an instrument, not their process. They'll understand what that means." He did not use the word silence. He did not need to. I understood that Gar had made a choice to shield my small ledger in exchange for a narrative that fit their reporting routine. That trade-off was not moral absolution. It was survival enacted through compromise. It was a real choice. They threw the observation door shut, and the metal thunk was the end of the chapter's immediate conflict. Voss clicked off the tablet and said, "File, incident closed, subject contained." Seal footage for review. Klein walked ahead and Gar stayed at my side a step longer, then turned away with his shoulders angled toward the staff station. I felt the notebook press against my collarbone and the beat of my heart move in time with the distant footfalls. For now, the method they used to erase voices had not succeeded entirely. Some records remained, hidden in a seam and on a pair of hands that had chosen not to reveal everything. They wheeled me to a sterile holding cell and wedged me into a chair. I sat with a ragged breath while Gar secured the outside door. When he left, he did not look back. The final beat of the chapter was small and concrete. A technician's boot on the observation floor, the click of a camera cover, the slow sliding of the annex door as it sealed for another test. I pressed my fingers to my collar where the ledger hid and felt paper against bone. I whispered a name, Hale, and then I folded my hands and kept still. The room enforced quiet, but inside my throat a plan began to take shape, one that relied not on noise but on records, on the small persistence of paper, and on the choices of the living who still moved within the protocol. The last sound was the annex door, heavy and final, thudding once as it shut and Gar's steps receding down the hall.